My name is Tran Myhre. My stage name is Guante. You see him, his pronouns. I'm a poet. I've been doing poetry stuff and facilitation that's arts based for the past 10 years or so. And so the idea of this workshop today is to think about, again, kind of going more in depth on some of the stuff we touched on in the keynote about like how can we use, whether your art form is spoken word or not, maybe it's a different kind of art, maybe you don't even think of yourself as an artist, but like how do we use our voices, our networks to keep changing the culture and changing the narrative. So one way, I mean, because it's a smaller group, like I know you can type in the chat box as much as you want. If you raise your hand, we can unmute you, you can talk. But one way that I like to start sessions like this is I have a plan, but we don't have to follow that plan. So when I say stuff like spoken word and narrative shifting and art and consent, are there any kind of like guiding questions that pop up for you or things that you're really interested in that might help guide where the conversation goes? Another way to think about that is like, do any questions come up for you? Not necessarily that we'll answer right now or might ever answer at all, but again, that might help drive where we take the conversation. So feel free to use the chat box if there are any. How to address those who get angry when you call out the things that you see. Yeah. There's a really deep question there related to the idea of like audience. Like, again, if you are a poet or if you're just like a person who's posting on social media, right? Like, who is your audience? And like, do you care if people get angry? Or, like they're all, I'm not saying there's one answer to any of those questions, but there's a bunch of like really interesting questions there that we can get into. So that's a good one. Any others come up for people? Again, I'm kind of putting these questions in like a parking lot that will hopefully we'll get to them eventually. Well, I mean, if you're still thinking of questions, let me ask you a question, all of you. I like to hear how other people think about this question besides just me, which is, can you think of an example of a piece of art or media, so movies, TV shows, poems, books, songs, whatever, but can you think of an example that made some kind of like political statement and that really stuck with you? Does anything like immediately jump into your head? So again, a movie, song, an episode of a TV show, a poem, a book, a play, that made some kind of political statement that stuck with you. And I think the idea of something sticking with you, like, doesn't always have to be positive. It can be positive, it can be negative. It's less about that than it is about just coming up with a few examples. So again, songs, movies, poems, that we're trying to make some type of political statement. So, as an example, Aisha Fukushima song "Pandemic." Yeah, actually, I don't know. I've heard of that, but I don't know it. And this is also, I mean, the other thing about asking this question is that it's a great way to like get some stuff to like go check out later. Oh, Hidden Figures, definitely another good example. There are a couple movies that came out really recently. I'm thinking of that I haven't seen yet, so I'm not going to share them as examples. But I'm thinking of what are they? I'm blanking on the names now. But there's a movie about Fred Hampton, Black Panther, Fred Hampton. And there's another one. Sorry. I mean, when we think about movies, one that comes up for me personally is 13th by Ava DuVernay. It's a documentary. And sometimes we don't think about documentaries. Yeah, Judas and the Black Messiah. That's what I was trying to think of. Thank you. But I was saying sometimes we don't think about documentaries as art, but like they're totally art. You know, if you're a filmmaker, you have to think about how shots are composed, how different voices like juxtaposed next to other voices. And I think 13th, which you haven't seen, I think it's on Netflix. It's about the 13th Amendment. Even apart from its substance, it's just really well made. Like it's beautiful, you know? The Ernest Withers photo from 1968 during the Memphis sanitation workers strike. Yeah. So there was an image of a Black man holding the sign, "I am a man." That's another great example. The idea of photography. But I mean, today, like at any point, but especially in that period when photography might have been one of the only ways people would see things, or like, you know, sometimes on the nightly news or whatever, but photography carried even that much more weight during the civil rights movement. And photography today remains very powerful. Watchmen, another really good example. I remember Watchmen stuck with me because if you have, again, it's a TV show, it's a movie, and it's a book. It's all based on this graphic novel by Alan Moore. One thing I appreciated about Watchmen is that it's complex in the sense that it kind of avoids like being like really good characters and really bad characters. Like everyone kind of does all kinds of good and bad stuff. And that I think in and of itself is like a commentary, right? On life and activism. Gil Scott-Heron, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." You know, like I probably would not be standing here if it weren't for that poem, because when we think about, you know, spoken word and slam poetry today, if you're familiar with like button poetry or like poetry that goes viral on YouTube, you know, that has a history that can be traced back through, you know, Def Poetry Jam in the 90s and like the poetry slam scene of the 80s and 90s, and, you know, up until today too. But then you can keep going back through, you know, the Black arts movement, the Beat generation. And Gil Scott-Heron's "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" to this day remains like the most famous spoken word poem, you know? So very like influential. Hamilton, for those of you, I don't know if you're just listening, I'm reading from the chat box, right? So Hamilton is another really good example. Actually, I haven't seen it, but, you know, from what I hear from people, there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on, both about the actual history, but also kind of using that history as a story to explore some other like important themes and stuff. So another good example, yeah. Oh, let's see. Another one I would share, just a song that stuck out to me. It's from, you know, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, but it's a song called "Film the Police." So obviously, like, it's based on an older song, which is also a F the Police, but like the song "Film the Police" was 3 different MCs talking about the importance of bystanders filming police interactions. And like the reason that song stuck out to me is because it isn't just a song that's about like police brutality. It isn't just about racism. It's a song about a very specific action people can take to like do something about those issues. And of course, not every song or movie or poem has to do that, has to have like a specific action. But, you know, when it does, it can be really powerful. I don't know if other examples come up with stuff like that, because there aren't as many, I think. Yeah, this is a good list. I don't know if there are any more before we keep moving. Thank you for like finding all these links and throwing them in the chat box too. Let's see. I'm also thinking of stuff that like we don't always think of as art, right? Like, because part of this workshop, because I don't know how many of you identify as poets or as artists. And if you want to talk about poetry, we can totally talk about poetry. But for those of you who maybe don't identify as poets, I'm thinking about how a lot of the tools that poets use can be used by other people, right? Like when I sit down to write a poem, I'm thinking about certain things that we'll talk about. But like those same elements or tools or techniques can be used for, you know, if you're writing a press release, if you are designing a flyer for like an action that's happening, if you are doing a social media campaign to raise awareness or raise money for, you know, a thing that's happening in your community, a lot of these tools are the same. And so that's what I would really like to draw out from some of these examples. So yeah, also reading the chat box, X-Men cartoons and comics from the 90s really shaped my social views. Yeah, That's a I love examples where the engagement with the political issue or the social issue isn't always super direct. It might be indirect, right? Like talking about mutants and stuff, like that's super science fictional and fantastic. But you know, there's metaphor, there's allegory in that too, about down or like oppressed peoples and oppressed peoples organizing and trying to fight for their own rights and stuff like that. So yeah, thanks for sharing those examples. Keep sharing them if more stuff comes up. I was thinking about, I'm gonna test out, see if we can use this the whiteboard feature real quick. Because I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I really like just making like collaborative lists of stuff. So I'm thinking about, I like this phrase of like, when we think about what makes a piece of art or media effective, the idea isn't that there are specific rules to it, but the idea is that there are tools. There are certain like techniques or approaches that we can use that can make a particular piece of art or media or whatever more effective. And so if we think about the examples that people have already shared, if we think about, you know, the poems that I shared earlier, but also we just think in general, I would love to just start making a list of like what makes a particular piece of art or media or like campaign piece of stuff or whatever effective versus less effective. If someone is trying to convince you of something, what works and what doesn't work? Does anything immediately come to mind? Because I can share a bunch of examples just to get us going, but I'd love to, if anything immediately comes to mind for you, please feel free to share. I can share a couple just right away, just like to give a little more context to what I'm asking here. So coming from the spoken word world, and I'll probably share another poem or two just as an example in a minute. Part of my research in grad school was studying and trying to analyze why certain poems went viral and other poems didn't go viral. So like, why does one poem about a particular topic have 8 million views and another poem have 8,000 views? Is it because, you know, is it just because one poem is better than the other? Like, that's probably not really it, right? There are these other factors. And so there are a couple things that I found when I studied the poems that had the most like shares, right? That people, there was something about them that made people want to share them. Not just that they were good, but they did something. So yeah, so display, creative, eye-catchy, or inviting. I'm reading from the chat box. I think that's part of it right away, right? So the idea of something that is eye-catching, that sticks out. And that can mean different things in different contexts, right? But a poem, you know, if a poem video has a title that's really, really like eye-catching or weird or outside the box, that might help people engage with it or make people want to click on it more, right? I can give one really specific example. I have a poem, I shared the handshakes poem earlier, right? For those of you who saw it. It's a poem about, you know, toxic masculinity, blah, blah, blah. I have another poem called 10 Responses to the Phrase Man Up that on a content level is about the same thing. Like it's kind of the same poem, but that other poem, the title of it was more like catchy for whatever reason. It had a bigger hook. Because it's literally 10 responses to the phrase man up, 1, blah, 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 2, blah, 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 3, blah, blah, blah. And like that type of format and structure seemed to draw people in a lot more than the other poem. So reading from the chat box again, when I can connect to what's being said, emotionally, values, human rights, etc., without co-opting the movement as a white cis gay dude. Totally. And you know, there's a couple of things in there. One of them I'll share is the idea of relevance. And I think that's a loaded phrase, right? Like a poem or piece of art doesn't have to, you don't have to connect to something on a one-to-one linear way of like, oh, that person telling that story, like I've experienced that exact same thing, so it's relevant to me. Like relevance can be a deeper thing about like how we connect, like the words that you use, how we connect to something. That's really important. And then I also think about what you're saying about co-opting and like understanding identity. I think what can I say here? I guess understanding the context between, the audience, the identity stuff. Sorry, that can make this text box a little bigger. The idea that, coming from my research, one thing I found is that the messenger of something really does matter. That's never neutral, right? Like hearing a poem about a certain topic from someone who holds one identity versus hearing about it from someone who holds a different identity, whether it's fair or not, whether it's good or not, it matters. It impacts how people will hear it, impacts how we enter into a relationship with a poem or something. And that's, important to think about. Again, it's a tool, not a rule. And I don't know if you said this in jest or whatever, but like appeasing the social media algorithms, that's part of what we're talking about, I think. There are ways to do it that are super, super technical and like whatever, but there are also ways to think about kind of the social media of life and like, how do you create something that people want to share and get excited about, and they don't just agree with it, but that it really pushes them. And that's a difficult question. And I think we have a good start on this stuff so far. Other stuff that I can share that came up from my like research or whatever is the importance of narrative. If you look at like the top, 30 spoken word poems with the highest number of views on YouTube, which, obviously doesn't mean that they're good. It just means they have a lot of views. But what that does mean is that there was something about them that made people want to share them, right? So part of that is storytelling. Of the top 30 poems, I think 29 of them were narrative based. It was people telling a real story, like putting a human face on an issue. Because, the example is always, if I get up on stage and say like, hey, everyone, don't be racist. Racism is bad. Stop it. Like, that's true. But it's not necessarily going to like grab people, right? And so storytelling, putting a human face on issues is one tool that we can use to do that. And we can talk more about that. But so yeah, and the other comment in the chat box. Oh yeah. So the way, if you're not reading it, it says remaining honest in storytelling while responding to trends / of the moment news. And again, two related concepts that are both really, really important. The idea of like honesty and authenticity, which also are like loaded terms to some extent. We could spend hours talking about what it means for a piece to be authentic or honest. But I think in a general sense, like, yeah, it's important to be honest. And I think that can play out in different ways, right? So part of it can be telling your story versus trying to speak for other people, right? When I write about, issues related to gender and gender violence, like I'm not writing them from a perspective that is not my own. I'm trying to write those stories from my own experience and my own perspective. And trying to like not just point a finger at other people, but also to shine the mirror back on myself too. Like that's part of that honesty and authenticity thing. And then, I also want to point out, just based on that comment, this idea of, it's another context note about, I guess the word I'm thinking of is like zeitgeist, but there's probably a better way of saying that. But that kind of in the news stuff, which again, playing with that doesn't mean that a piece of art or media is necessarily good or bad, but it's a tool that can get people to pay attention to it. Like if when I wrote, sorry to use myself as an example, but it's easy. When I wrote 10 responses to the phrase man up, part of the reason that it blew up and like got millions of views was because at the time there was a specific ad campaign running on TV. It was a Miller Lite ad campaign called Man Up. So it'd be someone, a guy who was like wearing skinny jeans or had a messenger bag that looked like a purse, and the beer commercial would be like, ha ha ha, you got to man up. And it was just so insulting and so ridiculous. As I wrote the poem, and I think part of the reason that the poem resonated is because people were also seeing that commercial. It was on TV at the time. Whereas today, that context might not be there anymore. So always pros and cons to thinking about not just how do you create something that's timeless, but also how you create something that is timely. that speaks to the reality happening right now. So yeah, another comment, answering the questions that people think about but don't want to ask. I'm going to change it a little bit. I'm going to say addressing the questions, because sometimes it is about answering the questions, but sometimes it's just about like exploring the questions. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. Kind of, oh, I lost my chat box here. Okay. Yeah, poetry. Again, I use poetry because it's my own thing, but for any of you who are any types of artists, like standing up on a stage or sitting down and writing or drawing a picture or doing a dance, like, is an opportunity to maybe have a question or to have a conversation that isn't just the everyday conversation of, you know, that people talk about, like, how's the weather, blah, blah, blah. So an opportunity to, you know, like you said, talk about the questions that people are asking in their own heads, but may not have space to ask out loud. That can be a really, really important opportunity. Let me share a couple other examples from that research, because, and then, yeah, I'll share some poems too. We can analyze them. But it was little things like stuff you may expect, like when I say it, but like humor, right? A lot of the poems that went the most viral, had the most views or whatever, had some sort of like funny element to them. Whether or not they were like laugh out loud hilarious, like they had some sort of like humorous piece to them. Another element was the idea of brevity, which again, we may not always think about, but like spoken word poems tend to be, you know, 3 minutes long, 3.5 minutes long. They're not 12 minutes long. They're not 36 minutes long. And that by itself, I think, helps deliver a message when something can be broken down into its most like fundamental piece and then pushed forward. What year was so in the chat box, there was a Summer's Eve body wash commercial that a man washed with it, then freaked out and did all the hypermasculine stereotypes, all because he washed with a women's body wash. Title of the video is Manly Mistake. It's kind of incredible how much of the most like the most, I don't know what word I'm trying to not curse, right? But like how many examples come from like body wash products, like shampoos, soaps, deodorants, that kind of stuff. How much that specific industry is very much built around this idea of like a gender binary, like men wear blue and women wear pink and nobody else exists, and like, you know, and just like how committed they are to these quote unquote rules that, you know, don't exist. But yeah, that's another good example. And, you know, a lot of the tools that we're talking about here can be used for good or ill. You know, like if you have a super terrible message, you can still use these same tools. And a lot of times the worst art, and, you know, that's whatever, the most like harmful art or media or advertising uses a lot of these same techniques. And that's, again, why this is framed as like tools versus rules. If you are out there trying to write a poem or trying to come up with a social media campaign for a cause that's important to you, what are the tools that you can use there? Another example, which I think relates to what was just shared in the chat box, but then also some of the poems from earlier, is the idea of concrete imagery. If you remember your, like, you know, English class or whatever, studying abstract versus concrete language. Like abstract language is like ideas, right? Concepts, stuff that were like, you know what it is, like freedom, but you can't touch it. Like it's just an idea, right? And so much of the stuff that people want to write about are abstract, right? It's like love and war and family and you know, it's like all the political issues, all the emotions, etc. And part of what poetry is how do we take something abstract and kind of translate it into something concrete? How do you take a big idea, like I was saying earlier, zoom in on it and make it small? So the poem that I shared, again, if you didn't see it, was about, you know, kind of the stereotypes of masculinity, the boundaries that are set around what it means to be a man, But rather than just get up on stage and talk about that, you think of a moment or an image or an object or something small that can be an entry point into that larger conversation. So the poem was about all that stuff, but what it was really about was a single moment where you shake someone's hand and they squeeze really, really hard. The idea being that in this stuff that you probably know, right, that human beings tend to process concrete information in a deeper, different way than just like ideas, right? If I want to say, you know, we should think about the environment because by the year 2060, 75% of the CO2 in the atmosphere will be blah, blah. I'm just making up words, right? But like the idea of that statistics, even if they're really important statistics, don't always hit people in the same way as, say, a photograph of a starving polar bear whose habitat has been wiped out and who is going to die. Right. And like that's the most extreme, obvious example of this process. But again, taking abstract things, making them concrete. And again, do any other pieces of art or media come to mind when we talk about that? Taking big, complicated, you know, complex concepts and ideas and making them come to life through the use of like concrete imagery and storytelling. I'm thinking about Inside Out, the cartoon, right? Just again, not necessarily as like a super political example, but just as an example of like Inside Out, if you've seen it, is literally about like the emotions that live in this person's brain, like talking to each other and having conversations and like doing stuff. And again, that's a way to take something abstract like fear and joy and sadness and making it concrete by creating a character for it and having that character have a face, you know? Any other examples? Cool. So we can keep adding to this list. We can keep thinking of examples. I figured one way to just to have, you know, another kind of case study to play off of is I can share another poem and then we can talk about like, again, the technique stuff that went into that poem and how we could relate it to some of the stuff that's on this list already or add more stuff. Does that sound okay? Cool. So I guess, I mean, since I've talked about it a couple times, I may as well share that poem that I was talking about, the 10 responses to the phrase "man up." I'll stop the share for, I'll stop the share for a quick second. And you can just, let me, first of all, because we don't have the interpreters, I'll throw a link into the chat box again for, again, if people prefer to read versus listen. I think the whole text of the piece plus some other thoughts are here in this link, which I'm sending not just to the panelists, but to everybody, right? I will say, I will say, like, I'm going to share a classroom-friendly version of this poem, just because, you know, it's a teen summit, right? So this is called 10 responses to the phrase "man up." 1, I know what you're trying to say, right? Man up means to do the difficult thing in the face of hardship, to take responsibility, as if women and non-binary people never faced hardship, as if the people in my life who taught me responsibility were men. 2, you want to question my masculinity, like a schoolyard circle of curses. Fine, just remember, not every problem can be solved by growing a pair. You cannot arm wrestle your way out of depression. The CEO of the company that just laid you off does not care how much you bench, and I promise there is no light beer in the universe full-bodied enough to make you love yourself. 3, man up. Oh, That's that new superhero, right? Like mild-mannered supplement salesman Mark Manstrong says the magic words "man up" and then transforms into the 5 o'clock shadow, the massively muscled, deep-voiced leather duster wearing Superman who defends the world from, I don't know, feelings. 4, of course. Why fights remove our chains when we can simply compare their lengths? Why step outside the box when the box has these awesome flame decals on it? We men are cigarettes, dangerous, poisonous, mass produced. 5. You ever notice how nobody ever says woman up? They might imply it, but it's not like a thing that people say. Maybe because women in the women's movement figured out a long time ago that being directly, explicitly ordered around by commercials, magazines, music, and media is dehumanizing. When will men figure that out? 6, the phrase man up suggests that competence and perseverance, both generally good things, are also uniquely masculine. That women and non-binary people, not to mention any man who doesn't, eat steak and drive a big pickup truck and have lots of sex with women, are nothing more than background characters, comic relief, props. More than anything, though, it suggests that to be yourself, whether you wear skinny jeans or rock a little eyeliner or drink some other brand of light beer or write poetry, will cost you. 7. And how many boys have to kill themselves before this country acknowledges the problem? How many women have to be assaulted? How many trans people have to be murdered? We teach boys how to wear the skin of a man, but we also teach them how to raise that skin like a flag and draw blood for it. 8. Boy babies get blue socks and girl babies get pink socks, right? And what about green? What about purple? What about orange, yellow, chartreuse, cerulean, black, tie-dyed, buffalo plaid, rainbow? 9. I want to be free to express myself. Man up. I want to have meaningful emotional relationships with my brothers. Man up. I want to be weak sometimes. Man up. I want to be strong in a way that isn't about physical power or dominance. Man up. I want to talk to my son about something other than sports. Man up. I want to be who I am. Man up. 10. No. Cool. So, a million things we can talk about there. That is the newest draft of that piece, which has been floating around in the world for 10 years now, in different forms. But thank you. Thanks for listening. I think because we have a little bit of time here, one thing that I'm interested in is when we hear a piece of art, whether it's a poem or something else, I could just ask, like, what did you think? But I think for this conversation, like this workshop is about, narrative shifting. It's like, what are the tools we can use to do narrative shifting work? And I think it can be helpful to like break a poem down into pieces, right? We can talk about, obviously there's the question about like, what is it about? What is its message, right? But there's also a question about how is it written? How does the language and the writing technique stuff and the structure help make that message come to life? And then with spoken word, there's also the question about delivery, right? So how does a performance impact how someone hears something? And again, if we just start there, we just start with performance and just start with delivery. Some of the stuff we can talk about there is stuff that'll be relevant even if you do not consider yourself a spoken word poet. It's like, how does the voice and body language impact how people hear a message? And so a question I could ask you just in the chat box or whatever is, if you didn't understand anything that I said, like if you spoke a different language, what could you still tell me about the performance? Like, what did you notice about the performance itself? Not even thinking about what the poem was about or the words in it, but just did anything stick out to you? Any observations about the performance? Yeah, that's a great observation. Well, okay, a couple came in. So repetition, rhythm, and pace are how we like build emotion into a piece. Because a lot of times the first thing people will say is that, well, it was emotional. And so the question becomes like, how do you know it was emotional? Like if we broke a performance down into its super, super concrete, specific like pieces, how do you know? And I think the way that you said that, like repetition can help build momentum, rhythm, pacing. And then the next comment there about negative space and kind of the pauses, the dramatic pauses as a use of emphasis, like as a tool for emphasis. Like that's all stuff that goes into spoken word. But again, not just spoken word, like if you ever have to give a speech or a presentation, some of these same little tips and tricks can be really useful there. Strong, focused. Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from, a lot of times I think there's a stereotype that spoken word is always just improvised, like off the top of the head. And there are people who do that, but most spoken word poets that you'll see on like YouTube or at a poetry slam, like rigorously rehearse and practice. Read a poem out loud over and over and over and over and over again, so that when you are performing it, you're not just reciting the poem, you're not just saying the words of the poem, but you're actually putting some emotion, you're putting yourself into the performance. And so a lot of that idea of like focus and strength, I think, comes from the process, the like rehearsal process. So I'm reading from the chat box: pauses, emphasis on words or phrases, getting louder or softer. A word that I like to use there is dynamics, the idea of, just what you said, like getting louder, getting softer, talking faster, and then slowing down. There's even emotional dynamics, but the idea is if someone's going to listen to you talk for 3 minutes straight, like how do you hold their attention? And a lot of it is stuff like that. Also related to the other point, the acceleration, right? So how a poem from the very first word to the very last word, rhythm is part of this, but also I like the word acceleration a lot because poems often follow like an arc. Like stories, there's the introduction, the rising tension, the climax, the resolution. And speed and tempo have to do with how we follow that arc. And then, yeah, the point about body language. So much of like communication, human communication, is not in what we say, it's in how we hold ourselves. For better or worse, because all of that is gendered, right? It's gendered, it's racialized, it has to do with other identities that we hold. But I think a larger kind of broad takeaway is that we communicate even when we're not communicating explicitly, right? With our facial expressions, with our posture, with our hand gestures, all that kind of stuff. And again, when I talk to people who are doing spoken word for the first time, a lot of times it's just, do what is comfortable to you, whatever feels natural and organic to you. Like that's a perfectly fine way to perform. But then, there are, if you want to go down that road, there are like tricks and tips to body language that can, if you are giving a speech or performing a poem or whatever, can impact kind of how people hear it, for better or worse. I think about feet placement, which is not something most people think about when we think about performance, right? Like, where are your feet? Because there's something about like, if I kind of move around a little bit, that communicates something. If I plant my feet and stand like this, go blah, 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 blah. Like it communicates something else. I think the takeaway here is when we talk about delivery, is that poetry and art happens in social spaces oftentimes. And so everything that goes on in that social space might impact how someone hears the actual poem. But it's probably, if we jump to the next kind of box or whatever, the thing that I think about there is, so we're talking about form. So the first conversation is about performance. The last conversation is about substance, like what was the poem actually about? And then this middle conversation is about the writing, right? Like what are the tools that you noticed in the writing that helped the substance come to life? And the question I like to ask is, now that we've been talking about delivery for 10 minutes, is there anything from the actual poem that you remember? Are there any lines or images that like stuck out to you? Anything about the actual writing itself? And again, I would say, because this is a conversation about tools, there doesn't have to kind of be a qualitative element. Like, it isn't necessarily like, what did you like about it or what did you not like? It's more like, what did you notice about the language, about how the poem was written? Did any, again, images stick with you, or any particular lines or phrasings kind of jump out compared to the other ones? Thanks for resharing that link. I did realize that it's a link to the older version of the poem, which also is not the version that I do when I'm working with teens. So like, you know, it's not like inappropriate in that sense. There's a swear word in it. So that's just the thing to know. Yeah. The line sticks out. Not every problem can be solved by growing a pair. You can't arm wrestle your way out of depression. Again, that's a rhythm thing, right? Like, part of writing is those little sentences that then build up to like the bigger sentence or whatever. Kind of, you know, it's like when you write an essay, right? The introduction, the thesis statement, the supporting paragraphs, the repetition of the thesis statement. Poems often follow similar, not always, but often follow similar routes. And even a specific stanza in a poem can do that. Like those two, like using examples, right? Like, here's the thing that I want to say. Here are 3 examples of that thing. Here's the thing I wanted to say, right? Like, those little types of structures can be really useful. Okay, thanks for that, Elise. And also, I mean, it's also an example of like using language that you actually hear in real life, whether that's pop culture references to stuff or just the way that you and your friends talk. Because like I said, this poem was written, you know, 10, 12 years ago. Wow. And so like that idea of like grow a pair or whatever was something that was maybe a little bit more common back then, although I'm sure people still say it today too. But like slang, you know, part of the beauty of spoken word is that, again, I think sometimes people think about poetry having to be this like Shakespearean, incredible iambic pentameter, you know, stuff, when really some of the most effective, impactful, beautiful poems are just people telling their stories using their everyday language that they would use to talk. So if you're a writer, like, that's a great place to start. It's just like find your actual voice and go ahead and jump in with that. So again, from the chat box, reiterating the phrase "man up" itself replicates the feeling of being ordered around by media, social culture, family, friends in a way that escalates by the end. Yeah. Another example of rhythm and structure of like, because that section of the poem is like blah blah blah, man up, blah blah blah, man up, blah blah blah, man up. One, repetition like tricks people into wanting to listen to what you have to say, right? But then it also builds tension. Like, that part of the poem builds and builds and builds and builds, and then 10, no. Definitely. Yeah. So the point in the chat box too about love your reference to gender fluidity, boy babies, girl babies, like thinking like going through the other colors, knowing that like there shouldn't be these 2 boxes that every single person has to fit perfectly in. And I feel like that's a way that, one, I think it's important in poems that are about gender to acknowledge that even if you are critiquing like traditional notions of sexism, to acknowledge that even that critique probably doesn't go far enough to critique the whole idea of the gender binary in general. So I think a section like that is a way to make that acknowledgement, to say that, one, there aren't just 2 genders, but even for people who do identify with one of those 2 genders that are presented to us. And like, you know, I'm a cisgender guy. I identify with the gender I was assigned at birth. But even for people like me, it's still unhealthy. Like, it's still like limiting in some very real ways, like emotionally, socially, etc. And I realize like some of this conversation feels like me just giving myself compliments for being such an amazing writer. But what I'm trying to get at is some of like, we all have these amazing ideas and like big ideas that we want to talk about. And some of how we put them into poems or posts or writing or other types of expression, it's some really like down to earth technique stuff. And I think that right away is a good takeaway, that like if I think about performance, for example, I am not a natural performer. I'm a very, very introverted, anxious, shy person, and I do not like to be up on stage shouting. You know, the reason that I've been able to be a performer, like as my job, has been practice and repetition, and just like doing it over and over and over and over again. And I think what I'm thinking about there is how you don't have to be born with that like impulse to do that. I think spoken word is such a, for all its faults, it's such a cool, like authentically diverse community, and that like people come to it from all different identities, from all different places, and find a way to, tell their stories. And I think that's part of why I'm interested in this. Then, so I guess the last question, we talked about delivery, we talked a little bit about form. One thing I'll mention about form, which again may be relevant to other people doing other types of writing and stuff, is like just the notion of structure, and how a lot of times when we're learning about poetry, like in school, we might learn about really super hyper structured types of poetry. If you remember learning about like haiku, right, which is always 5-7-5, or sonnets, which have a specific rhyme scheme and a specific meter, and like that's all valid. That's one way to write a poem. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have like the notion that poetry is just your rawest feelings on a piece of paper. And like, that's also valid. That's also okay. I think a lot of spoken word and a lot of my own work lives somewhere in the middle, in that there is a structure to it, but it isn't like a super, like I couldn't give you a worksheet of that structure where you could just fill in the blanks and write your own. And so like, for example, the Man Up poem is a list poem, in the sense that like you ask yourself a question or you make some kind of statement, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are just different ways of addressing that statement or that question. And that by itself is like a very, very simple kind of structure, but it can build an experience for an audience. It can build an arc. And you can see that how that plays out in other kinds of communication, like a social media campaign that has like a countdown. Like on day 10, we talk about this, day 9, day 8, day 7, and then like on day 1, something big and exciting happens, right? So just saying how this stuff can be transferred into other types of writing and communication too. Some from the chat box, I have a sweatshirt that reads "Masculinity is prison." That's a good line. That's a good poetic line. I bought it because I feel like it can definitely feel like that. A question that I've asked people because I'm genuinely curious. Can you think of and share at least one example of masculinity that has positively affected us as a society? Woo, I know it's a big question, but your general thoughts. I have thoughts about that. Do any of you have thoughts about that? So the question from the chat box from Cody was, can you think of at least one example of masculinity that has positively affected us as a society? It's one of those questions where it seems really simple, but then when you actually sit and think about it, it's really, really complicated and nuanced. I need more merch. I need more shirts. But yeah, before I share my own thought on that question, because it's something I've thought about a lot, are there any other responses to that? I do think if people would rather talk than type, we can make that happen.
Yeah, oops, sorry. I was just gonna say, if you would like to unmute yourself, if you could raise your hand, there's that button at the bottom of the screen, and then we can allow you to talk, and then you can unmute yourself.
I see in the chat box too. I think it begs the question of what we mean by masculinity, which, yeah, very important context question. I saw there's a hand up though.
Yeah, I was going to say the only thing that I can think of are personality traits. Nothing that sticks out as just being a personality trait. That perseverance. We like to say it's masculine, but ultimately that's a personality trait.
Yeah, that's a really important, like, I think, clarifying question too, to go along with that clarifying question about what do we actually mean by masculinity? Because I think if you walk down that road or follow that logic, what you get to is a list of traits, right? Like a list of kind of traditional masculine traits of like men are strong and courageous. And like those aren't bad things, but are they also necessarily masculine things? Or are they just like good things? You know, like do we have to gender those types of qualities of like nurturing versus tough? You know, like, but yeah, were there other thoughts? I'm already kind of walking down the path of where I would go with that idea. And I guess, you know, I can share from, I mentioned in the keynote that we did a podcast episode kind of around this question about like, should we be seeking as men, for those of us who in this conversation who do identify as men, like, is the idea to find a healthier masculinity, or is the idea to just like stop defining everything in terms of our masculinity and strive to be like a kind, compassionate, you know, good person, whether or not, you know, regardless of what our gender identity is? And I think you know, there's no easy answer to that question. I think what we landed on was that makes sense to me, right? It makes sense to me to think about what are the qualities that I value and want to embody. And they don't necessarily, like, the whole question of how they relate to my gender is kind of apart from that question. But the other, I think, element there is that, you know, gender is important to a lot of people, for better or worse. Like, it is one way that people make sense of their realities and of their own identities and like who they are. And so, you know, I'm not mad at people who try to reframe, like, from like a real man is tough to a real man is compassionate. Like, yeah, I would like to do away with the whole framing of real man versus unreal man in general, but I also understand the other side of that conversation. Kind of, you know, getting in the weeds a little bit, but I do think it's an interesting conversation, or an interesting question, I should say. And I don't know if other people have any other thoughts on that before we keep moving. Or any thoughts and questions in general about anything we've talked about so far. So I'm seeing, I think it's helpful for me to move away from binary thinking in as much as I can, maybe reframing in terms of masculinity, femininity, understanding and presentation of gender have impacted society. Where do we go from here, considering its impact, current implications, and how we want to see it shift? Yeah, that framing makes sense to me. About like acknowledging the reality of how gender has and continues to impact, you know, people's access to resources and access to opportunities and et cetera. But also thinking kind of future focused and like, even in a visionary sense of like, what does that world that we want to live in actually look like, and how do we get there? Ultimately, erasing gendering of the traits of humanity. Yeah, and that's something that came up in our conversation too, because it's like, I get why that would make sense to some people, and some levels it makes sense to me, but I also get why, you know, like, again, as a cis guy, I'm not going to tell like a trans person that like gender isn't real, because like that person probably had to get to where they are through struggle and through, you know, hardship in some sense to be able to claim that identity that does mean something to them. And so I think there's a both and. The last episode of the podcast we did was about, you know, what is our understanding of masculinity and gender look like in 100 years, or what would we like it to look like in 100 years? And we had, you know, 5 or 6 different guests answering that question. And some of the stuff we're talking about here came up in that. And that was really, really interesting too. And that it isn't like necessarily like, let's all throw gender in the garbage because, you know, it's a social construct, but it's more about let's have a bigger understanding of gender. And that like, if someone does identify along the binary and that makes sense to them, like, cool. If someone doesn't and that makes sense to them, cool. If someone, you know, like, just being able to have room for a more dynamic, like, beautiful, open understanding of gender. Moving from the chat box, whenever I hear someone say man up or woman up, I want to respond with, how about you, human up? Like, just be a good human. Yeah. I think a common kind of interpretation or misconception about that poem, about the Man Up poem, is that what I'm saying in it is that we should never tell people to like toughen up. And I get where that's coming from, because often that is harmful language. It is harmful to like tell a little kid who's crying, like even if you don't gender it, to say like toughen up. But I think the bigger point the poem is trying to make is about why, if there are situations in which we do want to say toughen up, maybe that's not the right language either, but like we don't have to gender it. We shouldn't put a blue sticker on that idea or that concept. It should be available and open to everyone, and also everyone should be able to critique it as well at the same time. And again, that's what I love about spoken word, is that like a poem can be relatively straightforward, but it can open up all these other conversations that we're having. Again, for those of you who do facilitation work or classroom work, I shared that list earlier. I can share it again here, but there's a million poems online that are about these issues that we're talking about, and they can be really useful, I think, in facilitation contexts. I want to go back to the comment. I'd love to hear you speak on, considering all of your identities, how do you gauge when it's appropriate for you to take up space versus step back? Yeah. That's a great question, because I think, working often with young men, it can feel like a catch-22. We're always saying like, men need to speak up more about, issues related to gender violence, domestic violence, feminism, gender equity in general. But then we're also always saying like, men, shut up and listen. And as much as it can feel like a catch-22, I don't think it is. Like, I think there is a both and there. And again, it's ironic in that this is the question and I'm just like talking about it. If other people have thoughts too, please feel free to either raise your hand or throw it in the chat box. Just because it has come up a lot, and like it came up on the podcast, we talked about it. I think it's about being intentional about what your role is and who your audience is. And that can be complicated. I don't think there's one magical key to that, but trying to cultivate a kind of constant intentionality versus like a one-time thing, where we're thinking about, is this a space in which it makes sense for me to speak out and speak up? Or is this a space in which it makes sense for me to support in other ways what is happening? And that seems like a maybe an easy way to think about that. And like life can be more messy and complicated, but I think that's been at least the goal. Thinking about poetry specifically, it's a really concrete example I can share is that it's important for me to share poems about these issues, about gender violence and gender violence prevention. But what I'm not doing is competing in poetry slams to win $1,000 by talking about gender violence and gender violence prevention. And I think that little shift, it may seem subtle, but I think it's part of what we're talking about here, about using your platform, but not like exploiting that platform, if that makes sense. It's a much larger conversation though. And I'd love to hear if other people have thoughts on that too. Because it relates not just to men and gender equity issues, but it relates to like, white people and racial justice work, straight people, cis people, and on and on and on around all the identities, about what is the appropriate way to both step up and step back at the same time. Yeah, reading from the chat box. Again, going back to the poem, there's the need for us to be resilient, but resilience does not mean emotionless or numb to pain. And that should be a poem. I don't know if you're a poet, you should write that poem, because I love that framing of resilience as something that is deeper than just like stoicism. That's a really smart observation, I think. I know we are running out of time. We have another 5 minutes or so. So I love that connection and collaboration, knowing your lane and merging when necessary. Another good metaphor. Like, there's a lot of poets in here. I think it relates to how Adrienne Marie Brown uses her work to bring in people to grow the conversation more. And that's actually another really good I'm still thinking about that question about when do you step up and when do we step back, related to different types of identity, but in this conversation specifically about men. I think another way to think about that question is like signal boosting. How are we using the platforms we have to not just like rant and rave, but to like share the spotlight and to create more opportunities for people who are not ourselves, right? And like that can be, depending on where we're at and what access to power we have, that can mean a lot of different things. A really, really simple one is like, I'm looking at my Instagram, right? And I've made the decision to that blue stripe in the middle is that every third post is something by like someone who is not me, just like recommended readings. And this is such a simple, like silly thing, but I think that's part of what we're talking about here is how do we do those little down to earth things that can then have ripple effects into how we move in other spaces. And the reason I thought of that was the Adrienne Maree Brown, which Elise just put a link to Adrienne Maree Brown's website in there. Adrienne Maree Brown has a piece called Relinquishing the Patriarchy, which again, that if those aren't words you're used to using, it can be a little intimidating, but it's a really beautiful, important piece that I think if I were going to share any like must read link, it might be that one. I don't know if someone who's at the keyboard can find that too. Yeah, there's the link. Thank you so much. But relinquishing the patriarchy was really good, and I think also gets at some of the deeper stuff that we're talking about here. But yeah, any last thoughts or questions? I can put some stuff into the chat box really quickly. I mentioned before, and I shared the link before, but just to share them again. Well, actually, I'll share this. This is a little bit of a different link, but it is, oh my goodness, sorry. I'm kind of all over the place. I have 100 windows open for whatever reason, but I wanted to share a link to a resource list of spoken word poem videos by a range of artists representing a range of identities, talking about a range of issues. Because I shared the one earlier that was like, here are a dozen poems by different poets talking about consent. This is a bigger list that contains that list, but also contains more. So like a bunch of poems on these like gender, masculinity issues, a bunch of poems on consent and healthy sexuality. But then it goes on to a bunch of poems on anti-Blackness and the history of African-American history, poems on whiteness and white supremacy, poems on xenophobia and like anti-immigrant hate, and just a bunch of stuff. This is an ongoing project of just trying to bring together like what I think are really, really useful tools for those of us who do education work and facilitation work, or for those of us who just like have a social media account and want to share some like cool stuff. Because again, that's where some of this work happens, is just in the social media trenches, especially with the pandemic and stuff. Yeah, so the question, yeah, being in Minneapolis right now, the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was the police officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck and killed him, starts on the 8th, which is coming up really, really soon. I've been involved in abolitionist work here in Minneapolis for the past like 3 or 4 years. And so it's stuff that's very much at the surface of all the other work that I'm doing. And I think the question is, in what ways does your poetry impact your local activism and vice versa? And I think the honest, and I know we're running out of time, but I can answer this pretty quickly, is that like, it does and it doesn't, in the sense that like, I think the biggest way my poetry and my arts work has impacted my activist work is through networks. It isn't about like, I wrote a poem about this issue and that magically changed people's minds, or I wrote a poem about this issue, so I'm a leader and an authority people should listen to. The real work is how being a poet put me in physical spaces with other people who were poets, but also activists, who were also, abolitionists and racial justice activists, and et cetera, et cetera. And so how much of like art has an impact, but the space that art creates has even more of an impact, right? It's about network and community. And that's stuff that is happening in real time right now with me, with pretty much all of my friends, and just everything that's happening right now in Minneapolis. How people are leaning on each other and like mutual aid networks and that kind of work. But that's a much, much longer conversation as well. And I know we're pretty much out of time here. So yeah, that comment, that movement family, chosen family, yeah, totally. So thanks. I know this was a little, all over the place, but I hope there's something useful in here. I hope those links can be useful to all of you in whatever work that you end up, being engaged in. And I thank you all, like, not just for coming to my workshop, but like for being here. Like, this is a really cool thing in Wisconsin, anywhere, but especially in Wisconsin. And so, yeah, thank you all for being here.